Welcome back to Exegetical Tools Basic Greek videos. In this video we're going to look at the first and second aorist passive indicative. Now the first thing I want to say is that the second aorist passive doesn't really correspond to the second aorist active. So you might think of it this way. You might think of it as there being an aorist passive, and then the first is the regular and the second is the irregular. The reason I do first and second is because some grammars do use the terminology first and second aorist, and as you're going to see, really one of the only differences, there's one other difference, but the big thing is that the second aorist passive just loses that theta, and that's really all it is. It has a different stem and stuff, so we'll look at that in a moment. But the big difference here is the second aorist passive you might think of as a regular. So it's not like the second aorist active has a passive form or something like that. It's just that there's one aorist passive and then there's kind of an irregular version of it, which we'll call the second aorist passive. All right, so with these forms, you still have the augments. You have the aorist passive tense stem, and this is going to be its own stem, as you'll see down here. Somewhere I had that this is the sixth principal part. So if you're curious what an aorist passive tense stem is, you're going to have to go to either a lexicon or to a grammar that lists principal parts, and you're going to see in the principal parts you'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and in that sixth position there will be the aorist passive tense stem, and that's if it lists all of them. Sometimes it just has dashes if it doesn't list a form, and sometimes it just doesn't put anything, which then makes you wonder, well, is this second one here, if there's only 4, is the second one the second part, or is it the fourth part? It's a little confusing, so it's best to have a comprehensive list if possible, if you can find one, and that way you'll know which one is which. But as you'll see, it's not as simple as just going to look at the form and then saying, oh, that's the stem. You'll kind of have to unravel it a little bit once we look at some of these stem changes that occur. So anyway, it has its own stem, the aorist passive stem, and then it's got this tense formative, and thank goodness for this tense formative. We love this tense formative. I'm going to draw a heart because we love the tense formative theta eta. It is a big giveaway. It's just a dead giveaway. This is aorist passive. We love it. We love it when we see it. And then we're going to have the secondary active personal endings. Now that's not a typo. It is the secondary active personal endings. There's a long and complicated reason for that as far as how the language developed diachronically, and if you can go dig it up in Smythe's grammar if you want and look at that, but the explanation still doesn't make much sense to me after I looked at it for a while, so somebody could probably explain it to you better than I could. But what matters is that it does use the secondary active endings. So this is one of those cases where it's just odd and you have to remember that it uses those endings. You gotta memorize that. Now, I've already mentioned there's two aorist passive, two different forms here. The first is recognizable by the theta eta. There's no connecting vowel. Notice there's nothing here, no connecting vowel, and that's because the tense formative ends in a vowel, and so you can just you can tag the endings on there without needing to add a connecting vowel, no problem. The tense formative is technically theta epsilon, and this is important to know because once you get to participles, you are going to have theta epsilon as the actual tense formative there. But in the indicative mood, it always lengthens to theta eta. So we do love the theta eta, but at the same time, it's the actual tense formative is theta epsilon, and then it lengthens. So I only tell you that so that you'll be able to remember when we get to the participles. So you won't have to memorize something completely new, but you'll say, oh yeah, I kind of remember that back from the aorist passive indicative that the eta had lengthened from an epsilon. Now, the next thing we need to talk about are the stem changes that occur with the aorist passive. it's not something that's going to really keep you from being able to recognize the forms necessarily, because the theta eta is still there. But what happens is that you remember the square of stops, and if you don't, then you might need to go back and look at that. But it's not really necessary because I have the rules right here, and it really just pertains to these certain stops that come right before the theta. They're going to change. So instead of having something like P followed by a theta, like pth, which would be very difficult to pronounce, like eblepthane, or something like beta, eblepthane, it's going to change to a phi. And that's really about how it comes out in when you pronounce it anyway, eblepthane, eblepthane. So it basically comes out the same way as far as how you would pronounce it if you were just speaking it, but the way it's spelled changes. So the P there changes to a phi. The beta would similarly change to a phi. Eblepthane, elamphthane. So it just eases pronunciation a little bit. And with the kappa and gamma, they're going to change to chi, ediocthane, aechthane, and then tau delta and theta down here are going to change to a sigma. So instead of ebaptisthane, which is kind of hard to say, ebaptisthane is a lot easier to say. Epasthane. So what you do notice is that the theta eta is still here in all of these cases, so you can still recognize that it's aorist passive. But what you need to remember is that that last letter before the theta may have changed. So if you are looking at the principal parts, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so you're looking at this principal part and it happens to be eblepthane, if that's what it happens to say as the first singular form, then you'll be tempted to say, oh, so the stem is blef. So what verb is that from? Is that from blefo? I don't know a blefo. But if you can remember that in the aorist passive, sometimes this letter changes before the theta, you'll say, oh yeah, so what did that likely change from? Well, it changed from, in this case, it looks like blepo, so it changed from a P. Could have also been from a beta, but you don't know a blebo. So in that sense, using this kind of method or thinking about it this way helps you to see the aorist passive stem and then kind of work backwards to figure out what verb it is. Now the stem might be completely different, like lamphthane. That's completely different from the present tense stem, so that's not really going to help you to say, oh, it's lamp. But with like blepo and verbs that are similar like that, it's easier. But that's only going to tell you the aorist passive stem. So in this case, the aorist passive stem just happens to be blep, like the present tense stem changes to a phi before the theta eta. But other verbs have quite different aorist passive stems, like ago, ankhthane, like that. Okay, third person plural ending. Here's where the son endings actually comes into play. You've memorized this son ending, but what for? People wonder, why do I have to memorize it? Well, here it is. It finally shows up in the aorist passive form. Instead of the nu, you're going to actually have the son down here on eleuthason on the third plural. So it actually shows up at some points. So let's look at the paradigm. You see the augment. This is the aorist passive tense stem, which for luo is just lu, like normal. Tense form of theta eta, and the secondary active personal endings. Active. Now the final forms, we can say it a couple times. You can say it with me if you want. Eleuthane, eleuthase, eleuthe, eleuthamen, eleuthete, eleuthason. Say it again. Eleuthane, eleuthase, eleuthe, eleuthamen, eleutheta, eleuthason. So the big one to remember is that the son is the full ending there. And there's no movable nu here necessarily. I don't have a movable nu here. I'd actually want to check myself. I wonder if there actually are any movable nus that occur with the aorist passive, but I don't think they do, but don't hold me to that. I need to look that up, and I need a footnote there or something to remind myself if it does show up. But generally you're just going to have it without the nu on the end there, because the nu, if you had the movable nu, it ended up looking like the first singular, so I'm pretty sure it doesn't show up for that reason. But you could double check me. The translation, I was loosed, you were loose, so it's still going to be perfective aspect, viewing the action as a whole, and then it's going to be in the passive tense, our English passive. Now the second aorist passive will be a completely different verb, and my paradigm got pushed down. Sorry about this. Let's get where you can see it. Okay. It's going to be a different verb. Notice it's still going to be the aorist passive tense stem, but for different verbs it'll just be a different stem. It depends on what the verb is. You're just going to have to look it up in the lexicon or the principal part. And as I said before, the tense formative loses the theta. That's the main difference. So instead of graphane, you have just graphane. And then it's still going to use the secondary active personal endings. It's just the same. So the only difference is you're losing the theta. This second aorist passive only occurs 32 times in the New Testament. So when I call it the irregular aorist passive, there's some truth to that. It is pretty irregular because it rarely occurs. And the tense stem for this one can be, it's just all over the map. It can be the same as the present tense stem. It can be the same as the aorist active tense stem, or it could be different from both of them. It might just be completely unique. So you need to just learn it from a lexicon. Remember, it only occurs 32 times in the New Testament, so it's actually not that terrifying that it could be kind of anything. And you'll still be able to see that eta in there instead of an epsilon. And notice that there's no accent over the etas. Notice that. That's important because when you get to the subjunctive mood, you'll have lengthening of the epsilon connecting vowel to eta, but it'll almost always have like an accent over it, like a circumflex or something like that. So the subjunctive usually has a circumflex over that eta or an accent or something. But in this case, there's no accent here, so that helps you realize that eta is part of the aorist passive tense formative. So this is final forms here: agraphane, agraphes, agraphe, agraphemen, agrafeta, agrapheson. And again, you got the son endings, so don't forget about that. That helps you distinguish it from the first singular. You probably already watched the future passive indicative. And if you'll remember, the future passive indicative has this tense formative thais, and so you can end up confusing that with this theison up here. So let me see if I can actually find the future passive. See what I'm looking for here. Yeah, something like theisontai. I mean, what you just want to remember is that this the future passive is building off the aorist passive, and that's why it's using the theta eta, because it actually it really builds off the aorist passive. So you do see the theta eta here, and then you also see the sigma. So you have a lutheson with the second aorist active, like the second aorist passive, like this, a lutheson. You see that thais in there, and you could kind of confuse that maybe with the thais of the future passive tense formative. But you can remember, see how this is omicron epsilon throughout. You can remember how not to get confused, because the here you have son, you have the alpha nu, rather than something like omicron epsilon connecting vowel. There is no connecting vowel with the aorist passive. So that's just one thing to kind of remember. If you see thais, it could be the tense formative for the future passive, or it could be this theison, this third person plural of the aorist, first aorist passive. Okay, hope that wasn't too confusing, but just remember the thais can go either way. That's it for the irregular or the second aorist passive. Remember, the translation is still the meaning is not affected. It's still just the passive sense of whatever the verb is. So here it's to write, grapho, and notice that graph, the stem, is the same as the present active indicative, grapho, I write. And here it's just I was written. So first person singular, I was written. It's just the passive sense of the verb. No big deal, no change in meaning or anything like that. Alright, that's the first and second aorist passive indicative. So that's all of the aorist probably that you need to know until we get to the participles. So good job. Remember, the aorist occurs the most throughout the New Testament, so it's very important to memorize the paradigms, but also to memorize kind of irregular verbs. You can stick them in your vocabulary list depending on what grammar you're using. Some grammars include like first person singular second aorist forms of verbs so that you can memorize them if they're really irregular. One example is elthan or elthon from erchomai. So when you put erchomai in the aorist, it becomes elthon. It's a very different word almost. It looks very, you can't tell it's from erchomai. So that's one you'll just have to memorize. So it's very important to memorize these sort of aorist forms because you're going to see them so often because the aorist is used the most. So get the aorist down and know it very well. That's it for this video. We'll see you next time.